Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're taking a deep dive into an incredibly important and revealing work, When Titans Clashed, How the Red Army Stopped Hitler, by David M. Glantz and Jonathan M. House.
Yes, and our mission today, really, is to unpack this monumental story of the German-Soviet conflict. Because this book, it's not just another retelling. Glantz and House use newly available Soviet archives alongside Western scholarship.
So we're aiming for a much more balanced account.
Exactly, a more nuanced picture. It really shows how the Red Army, through just, immense sacrifice and an astonishing ability to adapt, evolved.
From being on the brink of collapse in 41.
Right, to mastering incredibly complex mechanized warfare by 1944, and ultimately absorbing the vast majority of German military strength and inflicting, frankly, the most severe losses.
So we're looking at a narrative that genuinely reshapes how we understand World War II.
Yeah.
It's a story that, as they argue, really demands to be restudied, partly to honor the millions whose lives were just consumed by this incredibly brutal struggle.
Absolutely.
So we're going to journey chronologically through their main text. We'll pull out the crucial insights, look at the key themes that really define the Eastern Front. Let's peel back the layers.
Okay, so to really get the Red Army that faced Hitler in 41, we have to go back to its origins. And there's a real irony here. The Bolsheviks, they actively undermined military discipline to grab power.
Right, during the revolution.
Yes. And then almost immediately they had to build their own strong army basically from scratch just to survive the Russian Civil War, which ran from 1918 to 21.
And that chaos, that specific experience, shaped their thinking.
Profoundly. It fostered this unique Soviet view of warfare. Think vast distances, the need for highly mobile operations. It was completely different from the static trench warfare everyone remembers from World War I's Western Front.
Now, here's something from the book that I found really counterintuitive. We always hear about German blitzkrieg, but Glantz and House showed the Soviets were actually kind of the world leaders in mechanized concepts back in the mid-1930s.
That's absolutely right. They were ahead, theoretically, and even in early practical experience, surpassing Germany at that point. Germany's panzers, were still largely experimental in their big 1940 campaign in France. And Hitler, back then, was actually prioritizing the Luftwaffe, the Air Force.
But having the theory in the early tanks wasn't enough, was it?
No, far from it. Despite that lead, the Red Army had some serious deep-seated problems. Their light armor was often, flimsy. Field maintenance was a nightmare, just a general lack of experience with complex motor vehicles across the board, and their radio communications, notoriously unreliable. Crucial drawback.
And the units themselves were problematic.
Yeah, the early mechanized corps were just too big, too unwieldy. They actually had to reduce their authorized size, and maybe most critically, this huge focus on offensive mechanized punches meant they often neglected planning for defense at the operational level, that vital link between grand strategy and battlefield tactics.
A major gap. And then came the purges.
Just as they might have been consolidating a real military edge, that advantage basically evaporated by 1939 because of Stalin's purges of the officer corps.
And it wasn't just losing experienced people, was it? It was the atmosphere it created.
Exactly. It created this pervasive culture of fear. Imagine trying to lead, trying to innovate, when any deviation from the textbook, any mistake could literally mean arrest and execution. It left them with a chronic shortage of experienced commanders at every single level. A self-inflicted wound, really.
A catastrophic on goal.
Yeah.
Did they get any practical experience before the German invasion besides those internal issues?
They did. Some brutal but valuable lessons. You have the fighting at Khalkhin against the Japanese in August 39. Zhukov led a very successful mobile encirclement there, learned a lot about large-scale maneuvers, but it came at a cost nearly 10,000 killed or missing.
And while the army's dealing with this, Stalin's playing international politics.
A very dangerous game. He was deeply reluctant to face Hitler without allies, terrified of a German-British combination against the USSR. That fear, more than anything, led to the shocking Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August 39, a complete U-turn from his previous anti-German stance.
Which then enabled the Soviets to move into the Baltic states and pressure Romania.
Precisely. And this tangled web then leads directly into the Winter War with Finland, starting in late 39. And that turned out to be another critical but incredibly costly learning experience.
How so? What went wrong there?
Well, Soviet troops, mostly used to milder climates, were just thrown into Arctic conditions. There was hardly any proper reconnaissance, no real terrain analysis. They basically advanced blindly against Finland's Mannerheim Line fortifications. The initial offensive, even with lots of prep and new heavy tanks like the KV-1s, just failed spectacularly. They had to call it off by December.
A real wake-up call. But sometimes those harsh lessons are the ones that stick. Did it force changes?
It did, crucial ones. This costly victory spurred major reforms. Unity of command was restored, reducing the power of the political commissars who often interfered. A new, much harsher military justice code came in. And significantly successful pragmatic leaders like Zhukov and Timoshenko were promoted. They immediately started large-scale training exercises to fix the problems Finland exposed.
Which brings us right to the edge of Barbarossa, 1940-41. The Soviets are planning, but Stalin's still hoping to avoid war.
Absolutely. His strategic planning, even with revised plans after Poland was partitioned, was fundamentally hampered by his fixation on maintaining peace, or at least delaying war. His strategy of creeping up to war, a sort of covert mobilization ongoing since '37, meant forces were poorly positioned, badly trained for a sudden onslaught, and not properly equipped. Plus, he fundamentally misjudged where the main German blow would fall. He expected it in the south for resources.
But the Germans planned their main effort elsewhere.
Yes, towards the north and center. And from the German side, the motivation for Barbarossa was this toxic mix. Deep ideological hatred, irritation with Stalin's moves in the Baltics and Balkans, and, ironically, their growing dependence on Soviet raw materials. Hitler actually ordered planning for the invasion back in July 1940. That's before the Battle of Britain was even decided.
So, June 1941. Barbarossa is unleashed. The German army looks invincible at the peak of its power, but Glantz and House point out weaknesses.
They do. Even the seemingly unstoppable force had critical flaws. Virtually no strategic reserves to sustain a long campaign. Logistics were a looming nightmare. Think over 2,000 different vehicle types, 73 tank variants to keep supplied and repaired. And their core plan fatally underestimated Soviet resilience, Stalin's grip on power, and the sheer size of the country. They focused on quick encirclement battles, not grabbing territory for the long haul.
The initial Soviet collapse was still catastrophic, though.
Oh, absolutely. Swift. Devastating. German air superiority was total. Soviet communications just disintegrated. Stalin was issuing impossible counterattack orders out of desperation and lack of information. Yet even then, the book highlights incredible pockets of fierce resistance, like the 2nd Tank Division's KV-1 and KV-2 heavy tanks, stopping the German 6th Panzer Division cold for 2 days at Raseiniai.
Just buying time with immense sacrifice.
Exactly. And crucially, the main German thrust, Army Group Center, was actually stopped for the first time at Smolensk. A significant, though temporary, check.
And even in those huge encirclements like Minsk and Kiev, horrific losses. Over 1 million captured or killed, and those two alone, many Soviet soldiers apparently managed to escape, just without their heavy gear.
Yes, that's a key point Glantz and House make. These escapees formed a vital pool of experienced manpower for rebuilding units later, often overlooked. But we have to touch on the sheer brutality. The infamous Commissar orders shoot political officers on sight. Other orders basically gave German soldiers a free pass for atrocities against civilians and POWs.
The treatment of Soviet POWs was particularly horrific.
Appalling. Starvation, forced marches, neglect. Their situation only slightly improved, quote-unquote, later when the Nazis realized they could be used as slave labor. Just barbaric.
Yet amidst all this horror and defeat, the Soviets somehow managed this incredible recovery.
It's almost miraculous. The Red Army showed this unbelievable capacity to rebuild shattered units, create entirely new armies, seemingly from nothing. By the end of June 41, just weeks into the war, they mobilized 5.3 million reservists. That created 13 new field armies in June and July alone.
And the industrial effort, moving factories eastward.
Monumental. An evacuation on a scale hard to comprehend. 523 key industrial firms, over 500,000 workers moved lock, stock, and barrel from Moscow and other threatened areas to the Urals. Places like Tankograd sprang up.
That industrial muscle was key, wasn't it? It completely defied German expectations.
Absolutely fundamental. It highlights that fatal German underestimation of Soviet capacity. Despite the chaos, in 1941 alone, the Soviets produced around 6,590 tanks, 2/3 being the excellent T-34s and KV-1s. That's compared to Germany's 5,200. And they produced more than double the combat aircraft Germany did that year. This industrial resilience underpinned everything that followed.
So, while the Germans are driving deep, the Soviets are already rebuilding, rearming. Which leads us to the Battle for Moscow, Operation Typhoon.
A pivotal moment. Hitler's decision to divert forces south to Ukraine and north towards Leningrad, while costly for the Soviets in those areas, crucially delayed the main push on Moscow. It bought the Red Army precious time to shore up the capital's defenses.
And then the weather intervened.
Famously, yes. First, the autumn rains, the Rasputitsa, turned everything to mud. Then the extremely severe winter hit. It crippled the German advance. Logistics broke down completely. Fuel consumption went through the roof just trying to keep engines from freezing.
Creating the window for the Soviet counteroffensive.
Precisely. Their counterattack in December 1941 inflicted heavy losses, shocked the Germans, and led directly to Hitler's disastrous hold-every-inch order. He forbade strategic withdrawals, which would cost them dearly later. Stalin's initial winter offensives were maybe overambitious, but they decisively halted the Germans before Moscow. And by spring 42, you see the Soviets actively learning, adapting their doctrine.
How so? What were they changing?
They started implementing integrated anti-tank defenses, forbidding costly frontal assaults, really focusing on hitting exposed German flanks. It was a clear shift towards deeper operational thinking. They began forming larger mobile groups, including the first tank armies designed specifically for exploitation breakthroughs.
This learning curve leads directly to Stalingrad, doesn't it? Often seen as the turning point.
Many consider it so. The German summer offensive in 42, Operation Blau, aimed for the Volga and the Caucasus oil fields, but it stretched their forces dangerously thin, and the Soviet counterstruck, Operation Uranus, showed a real maturation in their high command, the Stavka.
How is their planning different?
Months of careful preparation. They used more experienced staff officers. Crucially, they targeted the weaker flanks held by German allies, the Romanians, the Italians, and they achieved massive local superiority, especially in tanks. Something like 660 Soviet mobile tanks versus only about 75 German tanks in the immediate sector's mobile reserves.
Leading to the encirclement of the German Sixth Army.
Yes. And Paulus, the commander, couldn't break out. Hitler forbade it, and they were logistically too weak anyway. The German airlift attempt to supply them was a catastrophic failure. Stalingrad wasn't just a military defeat for Germany, it was a huge strategic and psychological blow. They never truly recovered the initiative in the East after that.
But the Soviets weren't entirely alone in this fight. Glantz and House emphasized Lend-Lease aid.
They do, and it's crucial not to underestimate it. Starting significantly in late 41, aid from Britain, and especially the U.S., provided vital supplies. Food, clothing, raw materials like aluminum and steel.
In transportation, right? That seems key.
Hugely important. By the end of the war, something like 2 out of every 3 Red Army trucks were foreign-built. We're talking 409,000 cargo trucks, 47,000 Willys Jeeps, many locomotives, too. This flood of transport and materials allowed the Soviet economy to focus its own immense industrial power purely on combat production, tanks, guns, planes. It compensated for their own internal logistical weaknesses.
Hence that phrase, the Allies bought the German defeat in Russian blood and paid in spam.
A grim, but in some ways accurate summary of how that aid functioned. It bolstered the Soviet war machine at critical points.
Okay, so Stalingrad shifts the balance. Then comes Kursk, July 1943, Germany's last big gamble in the East.
Operation Citadel, yes. Their attempt to regain the initiative using their new heady tanks, the Tiger, the Panther, technologically impressive machines, but crucially, they were never available in sufficient numbers. And sometimes they were thrown into battle prematurely, like the first Tigers near Leningrad and during the failed attempt to relieve Stalingrad. They hadn't worked out all the kinks.
And the Soviets knew it was coming.
They had excellent intelligence, and their defensive preparations were incredibly sophisticated by this point. Extensive deception plans, multiple deeply layered defensive belts packed with anti-tank guns and mines. The huge tank battle at Prokhorovka is famous, but it was just one part of this massive, well-prepared defense in depth. Kursk was a decisive Soviet victory. Germany lost the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front for good.
And this period, 42-43, really marks the maturation of the Red Army as a fighting force.
Absolutely. Through 2 years of brutal, non-stop warfare, they transformed. You see a gradual decentralization of command. Stalin himself starts trusting his generals more, giving field commanders much greater freedom to act.
Which allowed them to perfect doctrines like the deep operation.
Exactly. This wasn't just about sheer numbers anymore. It was about sophisticated combined arms warfare, concentrating immense force on narrow sectors, punching through, then unleashing powerful tank armies. They eventually had 5 or 6 to exploit deep into the enemy rear. Sustaining these drives required vastly improved logistics, too. It involved complex coordination of infantry, tanks, massive artillery bombardments, air support, and using forward detachments to grab bridgeheads and keep the momentum going. This was the blueprint for victory.
And that blueprint was put into devastating effect in 1944 with the 10 Stalinist crushing blows.
Right, a series of huge strategic offensives that systematically rolled back the Germans, cleared them from the Dnieper River line, liberated vast swaths of Soviet territory. Think of the Korsun-Cherkasy encirclement in February 44, 2 German corps essentially annihilated despite desperate breakout attempts.
Or the icy Kishinev operation in the Balkans later that summer.
August 44. That saw Romanian forces collapse quickly and critically, led to the capture of the Ploiești oil fields in Romania. A devastating blow to Germany's fuel supply, which was already precarious.
But the centerpiece, the biggest blow, was Operation Bagration against Army Group Center.
June 1944. Often considered the Red Army's masterpiece. Meticulous planning, incredible force concentrations, brilliant deception. It resulted in the destruction of something like 25 German divisions, over 300,000 German casualties in just the first 12 days. The scale is just staggering. Army Group Center effectively ceased to exist.
Even though the Soviet advance eventually slowed after Bagration due to logistics and losses, it underscores a vital point the book makes. The Eastern Front remained the main event for Germany.
Absolutely critical point. Even after the D-Day landings in Normandy, June 44, the bulk of the Wehrmacht was still tied down in the east. Look at the numbers. August 44, Germany has maybe 1 million soldiers in France, but still 2.1 million facing the Soviets. And between June and November 44, 62%, nearly 2/3 of Germany's irreversible losses happened in the east. That's where the German army was being bled white.
Which leads us towards the endgame. January 1945, the Vistula-Oder offensive.
A demonstration of the Red Army's perfected operational art at immense scale. Zhukov's and Konev's fronts achieved artillery concentrations unheard of, up to 250 guns per kilometer of front. They just blasted through German defenses, bypassed strongpoints, advanced rapidly. Warsaw was liberated on January 17th. The momentum was unstoppable.
And then the race for Berlin. Was it purely military or political too?
Very much political by this stage. The speed of the Western Allies' advance from the West prompted Stalin to accelerate his timeline for capturing Berlin. It became a race for political control as much as military victory. The Battle of Berlin itself, April 45, was incredibly brutal. Intense urban fighting, desperate German resistance, including civilians and Hitler Youth. But the Red Army by then had honed its tactics for city fighting, small, combined arms teams, efficient bridging operations under fire. The final symbolic link-up at the Reichstag on May 1st sealed it.
And the post-war map reflected this military reality.
Exactly. By April-May 45, Stalin's politically driven military strategy had paid off. Soviet forces controlled huge territories. Poland, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, about 1/3 of Germany itself, often accompanied by, as Glantz and House put it, indigenous military forces and communist governments in waiting. The foundations of the post-war division of Europe were laid right there.
We should also briefly mention the very end, the Manchurian operation.
Yes, August 1945. Following the commitment Stalin made at the Yalta Conference, the Soviets launched a swift, devastating attack on Japan's Kwantung Army in Manchuria. Again, not just numbers. It was surprise, superior training, equipment, and the effective use of those deep operation tactics, even involving complex amphibious landings in the Kuril Islands, a final demonstration of their evolved military capability.
So pulling it all together, what's the core takeaway from When Titans Clashed?
I think Glantz and House provide this profound, sometimes really uncomfortable understanding of how the Red Army, through simply unimaginable sacrifice, we're talking over 10 million military dead, plus countless civilians, genuinely did stop Hitler. It's this incredible story of a nation's ability to learn, to adapt under the most extreme pressure imaginable, to mobilize on a scale that's hard to grasp, moving from near total collapse in 1941 to becoming masters of complex, modern mechanized warfare by 44.
And the book really drives home that the Eastern Front was the decisive theater. It absorbed the vast majority of German military power, inflicted the most catastrophic losses, while, as we discussed, that crucial Lend-Lease aid provided a vital material backbone.
It really challenges any simplistic narrative. It shows us not just a brutal slugfest, which it certainly was, but also a dynamic, evolving military conflict where strategy, doctrine, industrial power, and sheer human will profoundly shape the outcome.
It's a story of endurance, military evolution, and the horrifying costs of total war that, as they argue, we absolutely need to keep studying and learning from is more than just history. It's a stark lesson in resilience and adaptation.
Absolutely. The ability to learn from mistakes, even catastrophic ones, and rebuild, that's a central theme.
So, thinking about everything we've covered, what stands out most to you, our listener, from this incredibly detailed account? How does understanding this monumental, brutal struggle on the Eastern Front challenge, or maybe confirm your own perceptions of World War II? We really hope this deep dive into When Titans Clashed has offered you some fresh insights, maybe a few aha moments to mull over.